All right, Life Group leaders, this is a Life Group Bible study for week commencing 10th of November 2025. And we're in a preaching series at the moment called The Jesus Revolution, How Christianity Changed the World. And we were specifically looking at freedom from physical slavery. And you may remember these scenes in 2020. This is a Black Lives Matter protest on 7th of June at the statue of Edward Colston, pulled down for his involvement in the slave trade. And Sir Keir Starmer said this: you can't, in 21st century Britain, have a slaver on a statue. A conviction many of us would agree with. But where does this conviction come from? Ancient philosophy didn't teach it. Aristotle said that there are those who are by nature slaves. Secularism, or thinking outside of faith, struggles to explain it. It is impossible to develop a secular account of human dignity adequate for grounding human rights, said Nicholas Walterstoff. And history doesn't teach freedom from slavery. All known societies, says Rodney Stark, above the very primitive level, have been slave societies. So where does the conviction that slavery is wrong come from? Well, we would argue a lot from the Bible. The Old Testament, we see one of the building blocks of the story of the people of God in the Old Testament, of God rescuing his people from slavery. We then see him giving the law which specifically disallows kidnap. In fact, it's punishable by death. And although there are regulations in the Old Testament regarding slavery, they are not an endorsement of it. Then within the New Testament, Jesus comes, he proclaims that he's been sent to proclaim freedom for the prisoners. He does this in part by taking on the form of a slave, dying the death of a slave to make us into one new humanity where there is neither slave nor free. We then see anti-slavery teaching in 1 Timothy 1 verse 9 to 10. Slave traders are called ungodly, sinful, unholy, and irreligious. And then there are regulations regarding slavery. However, these regulations are not an endorsement of it. We see this most perhaps beautifully outworked within the book of Philemon. You might want to pause me and read that book together. Don't worry, it's only one chapter, and we'll come back then to look at it. So a lovely little letter. There are three main characters. There's Paul, there's Philemon, and there's Onesimus. Paul writing to his friend Philemon that he's helped to plant churches with. Onesimus, the slave of Philemon, has likely had some kind of conflict with Philemon, fled and run, come to Paul. Paul perhaps has led him to Jesus, and Onesimus has served Paul, but Paul is now sending Onesimus back to Philemon, and he's requesting that Philemon receive Onesimus not as a slave, but as a brother. Not as a slave, but as a brother. And there are some beautiful gospel pictures within this story. We see Paul appealing to Philemon like God appeals to us through Jesus. We see Paul writing to Onesimus saying that he's willing to pay, writing to Philemon saying that he's willing to pay the price for Onesimus. Wonderful example of outworking Jesus paying the price for us. And then we see this hopeful expectation that Onesimus and Philemon will be restored to relationship where once Onesimus was a slave, but now he will be received as a son. Again, a beautiful gospel picture showing the adoption of how through Jesus we approach the Father not as slaves to sin, not as his slaves primarily, but as his sons. It was this kind of teaching that led to the abolition of slavery. Brian Davis said this: religion was the central concern of all the British abolitionist leaders, without which the fall of New World slavery could not have occurred, and that this amounts to a moral achievement that may have no parallel. Wilberforce, working with the slavers themselves, helped champion the abolition of slavery in 1807 and the emancipation or freeing of slaves in 1833. One of their key kind of marketing phrases was "no longer as a slave, but a brother," taken directly from Philemon chapter 1, verse 16. So here are 3 questions for you. How would you answer the criticism that the Bible condones slavery? What lessons can we draw from Paul's approach to handling the tricky pastoral issue of Onesimus? And what are your reflections on the fact that cultural transformation around slavery took centuries and lots of hard work? Hope you find that helpful.